Yeah, so I think what we're going to do is kind of a brief history of the water system, particularly the South Line where we get the majority of our water. We'll move on to talking about the current water system, what it looks like, and then we'll move to why it's vulnerable. And I think you'll start to understand why it's vulnerable as we get to that point. And then we'll really move on to the emergency drinking water kind of techniques and options that you may have. So, a little bit about me. I've worked for Seattle Public Utilities for it'll be 19 years in January. The bulk of the work that I've done, I was the lead for Seattle's spill response team, and that was the only Seattle resource for emergency environmental response. So, we had a 12-person crew, and we did everything from cleaning up spills, managing spill incidents, to investigating and issuing fines and penalties. A lot of that work had to do with managing emergencies. So I moved over into emergency management where I work now. My primary job is training and exercise coordinator. I look at emergency response plans that the city has, and I build exercises and trainings that try and essentially break those and then give them back to the planners to say, hey, you thought this was going to work this way. When we tested it, it didn't. You need to rewrite it in these spots. So I have a pretty unique job. It's fun. Also, when there are system emergencies or emergencies in the city, I help manage those incidents. So let's step back in time a little bit. This is a map from 1884 of the city of Seattle. Remember, he arrived in 1881. So this would have been pretty much what it looked like when he arrived. And in this map, we can actually see some of the first inklings of a water system. So along the waterfront, you can see these water tanks and reservoirs. The first drinking water for the city was collected from springs and creeks in the hills of downtown Seattle. For example, one of the things I was reading was there was a communal drinking well on James Street, basically where I-5 is now. So that's kind of where water was coming from. Henry Yesler was the first person to establish a water pipe. It was basically a log that they bored holes through, and that powered the first steam-powered lumber mills along the waterfront. The first actual distribution system was built in 1881 by John Leary. He formed the Spring Hill Water Company. Not a creative name considering, but it said what he was doing, and they collected that water from what he called bubbling wells. And really quickly, those wells could not meet demand. Then they started to actually pump water from Lake Washington near Coleman Park to a reservoir that was built on Beacon Hill. That was partially successful, but quickly wasn't. The same year that Mr. Thompson arrived, 1881, he was already looking east for other water sources and had already started to make recommendations to city council to establish a water supply that was outside of the city. The guy had a lot of foresight. And by the way, you didn't just hop on the freeway or drive your car out to Maple Valley. It was a trip. On June 6, 1889, an overheated glue pot started a fire. That fire defines the city of Seattle to this day. The city did kind of rise like a phoenix from the ashes. Side note, not related to the water system, this process of newly established towns and cities in the West burning down was kind of a thing. Everybody was kind of doing it back then. One of the things that helped our lumber industry here in the Pacific Northwest was us providing that timber for these new towns being constructed and then resupplying them with the same timber after it burned down and they decided to build it again. So that's kind of a really good business model. This slide shows the impacted area of Seattle where the fire burned. And actually, this plaque that I have up here on the upper left, you can find that plaque on the federal building on the southwest corner of First and Madison. It's still there, kind of tucked into the bushes, but it's sitting there on the side. So while that fire occurred in 1889, Reginald Thompson had recommended the city council that the gravity water system from the Cedar River would be a good source back in 1881. Remember, he arrived in September of 1881 and was already kind of starting to think of this stuff. Other people were saying, hey, no, we can just put more pumps in Lake Washington and pump the water over into the city. But Mr. Thompson was kind of keen on the pollution that was already starting to form. The population in 1880 was 3,500 people, and then in 1900, it was about 150,000. After the fire, seeing that population boom, city council brought to the people through a special election the request to start building this water system. And that was passed 1 month after the fire in July of 1889. So here's a picture of Seattle's first water department. These are the engineers. You can see our friend Reginald there at the back. As a connoisseur of mustaches myself, I'm impressed by these gentlemen. So this gives you some perspective as to where the water system was starting. This is obviously an aerial photo from now, but I want you to think about in the 1890s how far away this distance was. There weren't cars necessarily. There weren't actually a lot of roads that would make it out to some of these areas. The pipes that had to be installed from this point here where it's at now had to go to the two reservoirs, Volunteer Park and Lincoln Park, that were being constructed at the same time in Seattle. So here's some pictures of the first kind of dam. These photos were taken in 1899. They show the Landsberg water intake where the pipes start. I've actually stood where these gentlemen are standing. That still exists to this day. The elevation of this intake is about 543 feet above sea level, and that's kind of important as we start to talk about our system and gravity. Some other key elevations to put things into perspective. Jefferson Park on Beacon Hill is about 100 feet above sea level. Volunteer Park is about 130 feet that's above sea level. Queen Anne is 125 feet. West Seattle's highest point is 150 feet. And Magnolia's highest point is about 110 feet. So we start to get a picture of how we're going to use gravity to pressurize our water system. And another key point is that Lake Young's, which is where the water heads from this point, is at an elevation of 498 feet. So that's the head pressure we're talking about when it starts to enter pipes. So as a side note, if you ever take a look at a topographical map of Seattle and most cities, particularly on the West Coast where we have actual topography, you'll see those high points will have a water tower or a water tank. That holds true for the city of Seattle because we have to have capacity within our system along with that head pressure. These photos show the installation of the pipe in 1899 through 1900. This is the Renton and Maple Valley area. Photo on the right is what they called a riveting gang, and they're standing on top of what would be pipeline number one. All of these photos show pipeline number one being installed. You'll notice the complete lack of heavy equipment in these photos. In fact, they're using tripods and pulleys to move this very heavy pipe around that they're building basically in the field. Here's some interesting photos that kind of show today and back then. The photo on the left was taken September 1st, 1889. You can see the building in the background. That building is still there. These guys are standing basically where the S curves of 405 would be today.
The pipe that these folks are putting in the ground way back when is made of what?
They're iron. It's riveted iron pipe. That being
Excellent.
said, there was wood stave pipe in areas that were above ground. So there was basically like 2x6 pieces of wood that were formed together like you would form a barrel, and they were wrapped with wire.
Just to say, they were built out of cedar. I used to work at the Renton Historical Society, and I lived out in Maple Valley, and I drove past wood pipe every day. It is gigantic. It was amazing.
It wasn't that long ago where it got switched over to, in that area, concrete pipe. The way I became really familiar with this water system is I had to build an exercise that simulated the damage that would be caused by a large earthquake, and then our written processes for inspecting critical infrastructure. So I went to all of these facilities and these pipelines with one of our engineers to get kind of an idea of the scope of what needs to be inspected post earthquake. We call it damage assessment. So I got really familiar with where this infrastructure was. And in this photo, I was looking at it and I was looking at the background and I noticed, oh, that's Lake Washington. That's Mercer Island. I know exactly where that picture was taken. So I went over to Google Earth and looked at this picture, and I'm not kidding. There's this shack that is in that picture there, right there, that still exists to this day. It's a garage. This road here is actually the pipeline road. It's an easement line that has now been turned into almost like an alley for houses addressed off of the opposite side of the road. And that's that structure now. So that's 1889 or 1890. The lower left is September of 1889. This is the pipe being installed looking up Queen Anne. And then on the right is a curve in the pipe at 12th Avenue South and South Washington Street, March 2nd, 1900. The upper left is Volunteer Park Reservoir under construction, September 8th of 1889. And then the right is Lincoln Park Reservoir, September 18th, 1889. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. These reservoirs are being constructed, this pipeline's getting laid, and kind of like the railroads, we're going to meet in the middle, right? And we're going to connect all of these systems together. So this is Volunteer Park Reservoir, completed in
Yeah.
1900.
Did I hear you right? There's a reservoir in Lincoln Park?
Yeah, it's still there. It's not used right now.
Is it a pile of water available?
No, it's empty. We did a lot of covering of reservoirs, and so it is offline. This picture of these jovial men is a gentleman from the city council taking the first sips or testing the Cedar River water. We're going to fast forward because we could spend all night talking about how things were constructed in the past and kind of the history, but this kind of gives us a little bit of timeline. The pipeline from the Cedar River was completed in 1901. A second line was completed in 1906. In 1933, Seattle started supplying water outside of the city boundaries. In 1936, the third Cedar River pipeline was installed. In 1954, a fourth Cedar River pipeline was installed. In 1957, the east side supply line was added, and that was eventually connected to the Tolt Reservoir, which starts east of Carnation. In 1962, the Tolt was completed. The Lake Forest Park Reservoir was completed. In 1990, SPU completed their first seismic study of the water system, looking at how earthquakes would impact the system. The early 2000s, we started adding new treatment facilities. The Tolt water treatment system was completed in 2001. It was a kind of a more of a modern water treatment facility. And in 2004, the Cedar treatment plant was completed, which is actually at Lake Youngs. We added a fish passage to Landsberg, where that water intake was at. That had historically blocked fish passage. In 2009, Seattle Public Utilities completed a reservoir covering project, or started and completed around that time. And that was post 9/11. There was a lot of issues with potential threats. And so reservoirs were required to be covered. And then in 2018, a second seismic study was completed, and that took into consideration the Seattle fault, where that had not been a consideration in the 1990 seismic study. So let's start talking about what the water system looks like now. Seattle Public Utilities water system serves about 1.6 million people. It's a regional system. It doesn't just supply the city of Seattle proper. Kind of an interesting fact, since 1990, our total water usage has decreased by about 28%. And at the same time, about 28% population growth occurred. We're coming up with new technologies that you see when you get into the shower or you're running your dishwasher, where we're using less water. And that's letting us maintain the current system that we have now, because we're decreasing that use of water, even though we're seeing increase in population. The city of Seattle has a really unique water system. This is our main reservoir, the Chester Morris Reservoir. It's accessed from North Bend. It's south of North Bend. From the peaks of the mountains on both sides of that reservoir, it is all private property owned by the city of Seattle. There is no access by the public. The only access by non-city of Seattle employees is the Muckleshoot tribe, who has some rights for hunting, some wood collection rights. There are some historical sites within the watershed that they access as well. The system has over 1,800 miles of water mains. Another thing to mention is our water system is monitored and staffed 24/7. There are people working on this system and monitoring it night and day to make sure that this system is working properly, and if there are any problems, to address those really quick. We divide our system into a few different categories: treatment, storage, distribution, and transmission. What you see in this map, the blue lines, that is the transmission system. Basically, it's the biggest pipes that we have that feed into the pipes that are on your street and in your front yard or accessing your building. This is the Cedar system that exists now. This is Landsberg. It is east of Maple Valley. That's where that water intake starts. That pipe system goes into Lake Youngs, which is another area where we control the land outside of the lake. This was a natural lake that we built some dikes along and dams to raise it up a little bit. And then we also bought all of the property. And by we, I mean us, the city and the community, the citizens thought that this was important. So we control all of the land outside of Lake Youngs. It's not publicly accessible. In fact, you can't even see it from any of the roads around there. From there, it goes into the Fairwood neighborhood and into a building where it splits off and starts to go north, northwest, and west. This is a picture of the Tolt Dam as it is today. That wall that those gentlemen were standing on is below this building here. We call this area the forebay. The small weir dam backs up the river enough to send water over into the forebay, which starts the flow through the pipes. Also at this location is fish passage as well as a fish hatchery at this location that the city built. You can actually see the houses of the folks that live there in the kind of background of this photo. And there's folks from Department of Fish and Wildlife that run the fish hatchery, and then SPU has some staff that are assigned to them as well. It's pretty interesting stuff. One of the concerns when they were building this stuff is like, hey, we don't want fish upstream of this water intake. And there was a bunch of studies that were done after they started allowing fish back. You know, hey, this actually didn't change the water quality for us at all. This is kind of Lake Young's again. You can see the R stands for reservoir, T stands for treatment. The water is transported across Maple Valley in two 78-inch pipes. These pipes here on the left, and this is where they discharge into the lake. This structure is called Control Works. It's near Fairwood. Again, it's a large piece of property that the city owns that you really can't see from any road. And this is where the system starts to split off. And I took these pictures when we were starting to design the exercise to test how we respond to an earthquake. The size of this valve that turns off this pipe is enormous. You can see one of our engineers standing next to that pipe down in that pit, and it is incredibly large, this system. These two towers above it are called surge tanks. So if there's any changes and fluctuations in the pressure, it allows that pressure to go up into this tank instead of build up in the pipes and blow them out. This is the Tolt system. You can see Duval here. It's on the South Fork of the Tolt River. You may have heard in the news recently that we had some false alarms. We have a dam out here. This is the dam that is above the South Fork of the Tolt River. We were in the news because we had some false alarms with our early warning system in the city of Carnation. And in fact, I just spent the better part of a year designing an exercise where we practiced how the agencies that would respond to a dam failure would respond to a dam failure. It was a 2 full days where people across East King County and the region simulated the emergency procedures that they would use to do an evacuation and respond to an emergency. It was a what we call a functional exercise, which is fully immersive, where people are receiving fake information that is realistic enough for them to make decisions and show how they're going to work together during one of those emergencies. You can see the water intake. So there's valves along the end of this tower. The actual drinking water comes through a series of pipes back here. We also control the temperature and flow rate in the river for fish passage and environmental concerns. Okay, so that system comes out of the east side there and feeds the north part of the city, as well as that east side supply line and also Mercer Island. It's about 1/3 of our water comes from the Tolt. You can see the brighter blue lines in the city of Seattle. That's still part of the transmission system. So let's kind of take a little bit more of the distribution system. Obviously, we've come a long way since that first map we looked at. We're not collecting water from the creeks at the bottom of the hill anymore. Basically, every street and a lot of alleys and other roads have a water pipe on them. You guys don't see this, but I think the closest thing you can see when you're kind of walking down your street or driving through your neighborhood are those fire hydrants. Close up. This is a more close up look, and what we're seeing here is kind of the neighborhood view. These red lines are the lines that are coming off of the city's water mains to the houses and apartments. So you're starting to get a little bit of perspective of the entire system and how complex it is. And as we start to move into kind of vulnerabilities, I want you to think of each one of these pipes as a potential failure point. So that third part of our system is water treatment and system maintenance. Our water is one of the few places where the water is treated pretty minimally. We use ozone, chlorine, UV light, and fluoride is added, and that removes most of the pathogens and the algae from the water system. The primary treatment plants, again, are located at Lake Young's and the Tolt, but there are in-town treatment areas, and those typically are places where we add chlorine because we're kind of looking at that chlorine level, trying to maintain a low chlorine level, but the presence of chlorine constantly throughout the system. SPU collects and analyzes samples of the drinking water every single day. I put this slide in just to kind of show you the last thing of the maintenance side. And this is yesterday around noon. And these points show all of the active work orders that are happening in the city yesterday. And this is just the water system, not the wastewater system. So each one of these points is something that needs to be checked, maintained or responded to. So this is when the system is working properly, and the amount of work and staff that goes into maintaining this really complex system on a daily basis.
So related to system monitoring, I was thinking about monitoring for of course, non-seismic issues like cybersecurity issues. Obviously, that requires a lot of technology. So do you also have cybersecurity experts?
Yeah, in fact, my next exercise I'm running is a cybersecurity exercise. There have been cyber attacks in the past year that have targeted water systems. And yes, so cybersecurity is something that is monitored through our IT department, which is a city department. When I ask the question, like, how often are you facing a threat? And they say, every day. So they're pretty tight-lipped when it comes to some of that stuff, which is kind of frustrating for somebody who's trying to build an exercise around a cyber attack. But we just look at people that have had cyber attacks regionally, kind of mimic that for those exercises. Even with all of that in place, one of the false alarms that we had out in Carnation was caused when the people that were building that system for us had connected to one of the sirens from Chicago to do the final programming. However, they did not disconnect from the internet. It reset the time in that siren to Chicago time. And then the siren went off 2 hours early during its normal scheduled testing day because it thought it was 2 hours later. People getting an idea that there's some vulnerabilities out there already, right? We have earthquakes. I'm not going to tell you about that. Here's some of the things that we found during the seismic study. The loss of the Cedar and the Tolt and the east side transmission systems is likely. That's like a magnitude 7 earthquake. The distribution pipeline failures, those are the smaller pipes that are on your street. We expect a plus or minus 2,000 failures for a magnitude 7 and a magnitude 9 plus or minus 1,400. Those are different faults. We do maintain most of our reservoirs. They stay functional. We do lose about a dozen of our critical facilities. That's everything from where we work from to some of these in-town treatment facilities. And then we can expect a loss of water pressure throughout our service area within 24 hours, a complete loss of water pressure. Now you're scared. Now you're like, I need to have water stored. And so I kind of want to talk to you about what we're doing about that. The seismic study didn't just go up on a shelf. We started taking action. And what we're doing is we're making seismic improvements. These two photos on the top, the one on the left with the red pipe, that's earthquake rated pipe in Pioneer Square being installed. And then on the right, these are isolators being installed to the bottom of a water tower. The isolators are at the legs of this water tower. They actually allow for movement. They're like little chunks of rubber that actually allow the ground to move and the water tower to move without snapping off of the base. If you've ever been in a high-rise building in downtown Seattle during a windstorm, you've probably seen or felt that kind of flex. This offers that protection. Knowing that that process of seismically upgrading this system is going to take some time, what we're doing is stockpiling critical resources that we would need after an earthquake. And the reason for that is those pipes and those valves and those specialized pieces of equipment, everybody on the West Coast is going to be looking to get those if we have a Cascadia type earthquake. We're already going to have those and be able to kind of get the system up and running. So it's kind of a prolonged process. However, we do have some stop gaps in place.
John had asked in the chat, how are leaks detected at street level?
The most common way is water's coming out of the ground.
And somebody calls?
Yep, somebody sees it and calls. We're doing a pilot study on the satellite imagery that shows us where water leaks could be coming from. There's satellites that fly over and we can find the smaller leaks doing that. But typically it's water coming out of the ground. And then it starts becoming really unscientific and kind of to my level is it's coming out of the ground in a hole right here. And you start listening to the ground and for where the sound is the loudest. And you start digging and you fix it. Let's look at how the system works and then talk about, did we lose water pressure all of a sudden or not? So this is an oversimplified drawing of the water system. This just shows that gravity exists. We have the reservoir up in the mountains, this pipe coming into town. The reservoir is at a higher elevation than this water tower. That water tower provides consistent water pressure to the homes and businesses below it, to the neighborhood, right? Through the distribution system. In this example, there are no pumps. There are some pumps in the city, but in this example, and for most of the city, this is true that it's not reliant on pumps. So when the system springs a leak, what we're looking at is, can the closest tank keep up with that leak, right? So if we have an earthquake, and we're springing a bunch of leaks, maybe not, right? Or if the pipe that is supplying the town breaks, the amount of water we have is what's left in the local reservoir. So once these people use this water, we're out of water.
Won't there be pipes between the houses and they're gonna all break and so they're gonna be flooding all over between the houses?
They're not all going to break. Some will. Some can. I will say that the pipes between your house and the city system typically are copper. Copper is a pretty flexible pipe, or they could be a plastic pipe. Those are a little bit more flexible. But that being said, it's probably been in the ground for a while and it could break.
Let's say they break kind of all over. One is the water is going to go out at the first break it comes to, but it may not go all out because it can't get, it's a small break.
Yeah.
It's a big break. So
Yeah.
we really can't predict where water is going to be accumulating other than once it breaks, it's running down the street, following gravity down the hill.
Sure. The one thing I want to kind of point out is in this scenario, the people who are going to run out of water first are the people at the top of the hill. Does that make sense? Because it's a gravity system. So they're going to run out of water. There's still going to be residual head pressure in this pipe until it completely drains out. And the people who are going to run out of water the last are these people at the bottom of the hill. And that rings true for the city right now. We had a water main break in West Seattle. I think it was last year. It was pretty significant. And in that zone, folks at the top of the hill were running out of water, while the people that were right next to the water main break did not run out of water.
So are the reservoirs generally full all the time? Like water's always going into them and flowing out of them? Are they in use all the time?
The large reservoirs, the two lakes that are up in the mountains, those fluctuate based off of precipitation and, where we
Right,
are in the season.
snowpack.
The ones that are in town maintain a level. Those folks that are in that room that is kind of monitoring the system, they will see that the reservoir at the north end of Lake Washington is a little low. They'll do some valve configurations from the tolt and they'll send water into that reservoir and maintain it at a level. There's constantly water coming out of those reservoirs, just like in this picture. The reservoir is feeding the tower or the small tanks by your house, which is supplying your house. We're gonna move on to emergency drinking water best practices, but I do want you to understand that, kind of answer that big question of like, how long do I have till I run out of water? It really depends on how bad the earthquake is. It depends on where you live. It depends on the topography of your neighborhood. It really depends. Just so you know, it's our priority to start getting that system up and running again, but it can take some time. Let's talk about what you do while you're waiting to get water or right after an earthquake. The guidance is a gallon of water per day per person. And your kind of guidance is how long?
2 weeks.
2 weeks is really a good, safe bet that we'll have some water restored. In the meantime, for the people who don't have drinking water, there will be emergency drinking water that's coming into our region, but it's going to be a pretty popular resource. Not going to be easy to get. It's going to be bottled water, maybe some blivet systems that are in some neighborhoods near reservoirs, but it's not going to be convenient. A blivet is like a rubber tank that we have around. It's basically a tank that we can move around town on the roads that are broken. Not really. It's reliant on a vehicle, but that's not going to happen right away because our priority is fixing the system. Having the 1 gallon per day per person is the best. That's like golden standard, right? If you can store that in your house, that's great, but let's be honest with ourselves, and a lot of people aren't doing that. So let me give you some advice on some other options that are available to you. First and foremost is you have a tank of water probably in your house. It's called your hot water heater, right? Most hot water heaters have between 30 and 60 gallons. Some people don't have hot water heaters. They have like an instant hot water system in their house. These hot water heaters are a great source of emergency drinking water. However, you have to isolate them. We'll talk about turning off your water. So for example, when the water starts to drain out of the system, it creates negative pressure. We maintain the system in a positive pressure all the time. That positive pressure keeps the water coming to your house. It also ensures that it's clean. But when the system fails, like we have in this, close up, it creates negative pressure. I've been working on fixing a water main break, and the water started to get warm because of the negative pressure that was forming in the system, and hot water tanks were starting to drain into the pipe I was working on. Now, that was really nice for me because I was pretty cold, but not necessarily a good thing if you're trying to use that water as emergency drinking water. So isolating your hot water tank is super important. Now, I said I would mention people in apartments. Some apartments, you have a hot water tank in your apartment, like in your unit. Some, they're a common boiler. You can see where living in an apartment starts to get really complicated really quick. And some of this advice doesn't work so well. What can you rely on if you're in an apartment? Having emergency water for yourself. So this is a typical hot water heater. There is a water shut. There should be, by the way, people do all kinds of things when they remodel their homes and don't build them the right way or put them in the right way. This is what they generally look like. Yours may look different. The point of that is tomorrow or after this, go take a look at your hot water tank. Move the Christmas decorations out of the way and boxes of clothes and go take a look at your hot water tank. There's a shutoff. That is where the water would exit your system by creating that negative pressure, potentially exit your water tank. So you want to shut that valve off. And the other important thing is this drain that's at the bottom. That's where you're going to get the water out of your tank. There's probably some sediment in your hot water tank and it's going to look a little cruddy, but you're already drinking that rust and mineral stuff. You just don't see that much of it build up. So what's in that tank is safe to drink. If it looks a little cloudy, let it settle on your counter or settle in your container. By the way, it's not super convenient that that's at the bottom of the tank. Now, if your hot water tank is up in your attic, where some are, you might have gravity to feed your house from this system by turning that valve on and off.
Catherine wants to know if in the time it takes to turn off my water intake, will there be E. coli already in the hot water heater?
Something would have to have gone really bad for that to occur. You have, when you go to open the valve at your faucet, you have residual chlorine in your house. A lot of things would have to go bad for E. coli to get into your water system during an earthquake. That being said, it is possible. We are not at any point, once our water system breaks, the SPU is going to issue a boil water notice and say, hey, our water system cannot be trusted. We recommend that you treat your water and you boil it. So if you still have water coming out of it, just keep that in mind. Like, we're not going to guarantee that it's safe. And by the way, we're going to stop sampling it because we're going to try and fix the system. We can't sample it to ensure that it's safe to drink because the system is still broken and open. So it's pointless. So all of our effort goes to closing that system back up. So there are a couple other ways to isolate your house from the water system. First and foremost, like the best way is like a whole house water shutoff. And that would be somewhere where the water system comes into your house, in your basement. It's typically where the pipe first comes in from the outside into your house. There'll be a valve and that isolates your house. So when you have a plumber come in to fix something on your system, they first would try and find this valve. Not every house has that. And there's two types of valves. There's the kind of valve that you're used to when you're turning on the water bib outside. And then there's this ball valve. And by the way, this ball valve is in the open position. If it's in line, that means it's flowing. And if it's 90 degree to the pipe, it's off. The other option is trying to find your water meter. This thing is buried under a bunch of crap in your yard and full of spiders. Last choice. Can be fragile at times, depending. There are tools that you can use. You can buy them on Amazon, just like anywhere else. And it's a T-handled thing where you turn this valve a quarter turn and shut off your water supply. Alternatively, you can use a screwdriver and a wrench to accomplish the same thing. You apartment people, we're seeing where this is getting a little complicated for you. And we're really pushing you to have emergency water, drinking water for yourself. Okay, we had the big earthquake. You're safe and you still have water pressure. I think at that point, and you probably haven't heard this before, this is advice from SPU, use that opportunity to collect the water you can. You can't just do this on a whim. You're not going to fill up your bathtub and have safe drinking water. You wash your body in your bathtub. Okay. There are tanks that you can buy that are BPA free and you can collect water and it seals it off from the environment. In your bathroom, fill up buckets, fill up food grade water containers. My advice, collect what you can while you can. There's a multitude of water treatment devices that are out there that you can pick up at your favorite three-lettered outdoor store. And there's experts there that'll tell you how to use them. What I will say is I would not be confident with any of these filtering the water in Green Lake after an earthquake or Lake Washington after an earthquake, because I know we talked about the water system breaking, but the sewer system is also going to break. And we treat over 300 million gallons of sewage some days. I wouldn't drink that stuff. It's not just toilet water, it's all kinds of waste. Know your device, know how it works, and know its capabilities. And I can't teach you how to do these. There's so many options. It does rain here. People do collect rainwater. Rainwater can come into contact. Squirrels and birds poop. There can be contaminants in that, albeit it's safer than what's in Lake Washington after there's a sewer overflow. That's where I would start to use these devices, is when I'm collecting rainwater. Another treatment way, and this comes from the US EPA, is using bleach. By the way, this is how we treat your water ourselves. I mean, we have some other fancy stuff, but this is our primary treatment.
Buy bleach in small quantities so that their household runs through it in about 6 months. If you don't use that much bleach
Good
for
point.
laundry or whatever, don't buy a gallon because it loses potency fairly quickly.
Our risks to our system come from ground movement, tsunamis, seiches, landslides, liquefaction, prolonged power disruptions, and then disruptions in the supply line. We were dealing with that this summer. We were watching really closely the issues with our ability to get chlorine because of some rail strikes that were happening in Canada. It's not just the system breaking. During a large earthquake, it's a lot of parts that are moving, unintended.
What does restoration look like? If you're going to tell me you're going to have water to me in 3 weeks, is that a garden hose running down my street? Is that me having to walk 6 blocks to pick up a case of bottled water and walking it back to my house?
It depends on a lot of factors. What it probably means is you're going to get low quality water coming out of your faucet. Water that we say is boil order. And that's probably not going to be 100% of the city. It's going to be portions of the city. Now, that being said, if the entire pipeline from Lake Youngs through Renton is utterly destroyed, we're kind of screwed, right? But we're trying to deal with that. What I learned doing this damage assessment exercise is that there are a couple points in the system where we're like, hey, this is probably going to break. Let's make sure that we have the equipment to fix this spot. And let's also move that spot high up on the retrofit areas. Our first priority, by the way, the city of Seattle is protected by sprinkler systems in any large building. Those sprinkler systems are not going to work. Our number one priority will be establishing a water supply to fight fire. Getting water restored for firefighting is super important.
Question in the chat, what to
Yeah.
expect with a prolonged power outage?
The system of turning valves and stuff will have to be kind of manually done. And where there are pumps, those kind of things would not work. In areas where we need power, like at our treatment systems, we have backup generators. Now, a prolonged event where we can't get fuel, those generators aren't going to work. We have redundancy when it comes to power, but a prolonged power outage with disruptions to like transportation where fuel's not moving, that can be an issue for us. That being said, the city does have a fuel plan, emergency fuel plan. We do coordinate with our emergency operations center and we get on a list of like, hey, we need fuel because the city's going to not have clean water. Oh, that's a pretty important reason to get the Seattle Public Utilities the fuel that they're asking for. We have very few pumps. Neighborhoods or certain pressure zones that rely on pumps to maintain a certain pressure, but it's not as critical of a component to our system as gravity. Our reservoirs are a few hundred feet below the top of the pipe level, but there's probably pumps in some of those places. The water towers, those are definitely have a pump.
Do hospitals have water redundancy?
To answer your question, some might. And what we're trying to encourage them to do is actually put in backup well systems at the hospitals.
Before we wrap up for the night, I want to summarize kind of what we've learned. So let's start with what to do now, before an earthquake, before you lose water, before the power grid goes down. Find and label the water shutoff valve in your home, and make sure all your household members know where it's at. You're looking for a valve that looks kind of like this. Find it, label it, teach everybody where it is, and teach them what it does. Next, find the water shutoff valve out in the street. Looks a little bit like this. Practice turning this valve to the off position, which means it's across the pipe instead of in line with the pipe. And do you have a tool that will work? Make sure you have one. Make sure everybody in your household knows where it's at and can use it. Put it in a place where you'll be able to find it when you need it. And again, make sure all household members know this system. They know how to turn off water to the house. You never know when you'll need it. The next thing is to make a plan to collect water post earthquake, after the earthquake. Think about it now so that you don't have to scramble to figure this out after an earthquake when you're really shaken up. What vessels do you have in your home already that can be used? So here's some examples. There are liners that you can fill your tub with. The one on top is 5 gallons. It's collapsed, but you could fill it up and it expands and it's food grade. Water bottles that are just sitting around, a stock pot, whatever you have should be food grade if you can make it. But think about how you might collect water if you still have water running to your home after an earthquake. The next thing is make a plan to disinfect that water post earthquake. Because, like Eric said, it might still be running to your house and it's probably pretty darn clean because there's still chlorine running around in the system. So it's not going to be horribly tainted, but it's never a bad idea to take a few extra steps and make sure that water is super safe to drink. Bleach is a really common thing in a lot of households. And if you have that around and it's still potent, it can be used to disinfect the water and make it safe for drinking. Make sure that your bleach bottle that you're buying says disinfecting on the label. Not all of them do. They all look the same on the shelf, but some of them are not labeled as a disinfectant. And that's because they have other weird chemicals in there. Don't buy more bleach than your household will use up in about 6 months. That's about as long as you should keep bleach around because it really decreases in potency, sitting on your shelf, sitting in your cabinet, whatever. And that's whether it's opened or not opened. Either way, it will degrade just sitting in the bottle, even unopened. Buy it in small quantities, just so that you make sure that you go through it rapidly enough that you're not having a bunch of stale bleach sitting around that's not going to do you any good. And the last thing is do not buy scented bleach. If you're going to use that bleach to disinfect water, that is definitely a bad idea. There's all kinds of chemicals in there you don't want in your body. And then the last thing to do before you lose water, so in preparation for a time when you might need drinking water, is to print out the handout that we've talked about from the Environmental Protection Agency, put it in a disaster binder if you have such a thing, tape it to your hot water tank. That's a really good idea. Print it out, put it somewhere where you will have it when you need it. This is what the document looks like. Again, it's from the Environmental Protection Agency, Emergency Disinfection of Drinking Water. It'll tell you how many drops to use. It'll give you a couple other ideas of how to disinfect water enough to make it drinkable. And then the QR code on the right is just so that you can go straight to that document that is online with the EPA. So print that out, put it somewhere where you'll have it when you need it. And then let's talk about what to do after the earthquake. When the earth stops shaking, take your time, stand up slowly, check on yourself and those around you. The next thing to do is to control those utilities. And the big one for us is natural gas. So listen for the hissing noise and smell for natural gas. If you believe there's a leak, turn it off. If you do not suspect a leak, leave it on. You will be very glad that you have natural gas running to your building for cooking or heating or whatever it does for you. The next thing is if the water is running to your building, collect it in food grade containers. Those containers we mentally prepped already. We've kind of already thought about what might work in our household. And then as soon as the water stops running to your building, shut off the water to your building, whether that's inside the building or out at the street or both. You really want to shut that down. And the reason for that is you don't want gravity to pull that very valuable water out of your hot water tank. So, what we've talked about tonight, this idea of capturing water after an earthquake, it might work. It might work. But to be truly prepared, bottled water is the way to go. It truly is the gold star of being prepared, is having enough bottled water to support you and your household. And don't forget your pets.